reign of Isham Rabin, I went over this, Abd al-Mahdi, and the collapse of the Umayyads, as well as numerous scholarly articles, including parody of Muslim and Western concepts of just war, and Muslim fundamentalism, Salafism, Sufism, and other trends in the Muslim world, and is fluent in both classical and Egyptian colloquial Arabic, has traveled widely in the Muslim world, including long residences in Egypt, Mecca, and Morocco, and is also known to and acquainted with many well-known Muslim religious scholars from the world, around the world.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here to speak to you all, and I'm very thankful for being invited by the Ethical Society of the Purpose. It's touchy. Okay. And I think I should give you a little more background about myself, and that might help to understand my position here. My background maybe doesn't differ from the background of all of you a lot. I was leafing through the songbook and I see some of my old favorite songs there. And my favorite singer always was Bob Dylan, of course, and I frequently quote him in my Islamic sermons, which I give because while I'm a professor at Temple University, I'm also the imam of the Muslim Society of the Delaware Valley, or the Front Street Mosque at Front and Susquehanna, which is a very small mosque with a very big name, a long title. My background is that my family were non-religious Protestant Christians. All four of my grandparents separately were not religious, and I would love to regale you with stories about them, but I think I'll pass on from that and let that be sufficient information. And my parents were likewise not religious, and my one uncle also not religious. And yet when my grandmother died in 1954, my beloved grandmother, and I should emphasize also, I mentioned maybe I'm half British and half Norwegian by extraction. All of my British ancestors came in the 17th and 18th centuries. Ralph Blankinship, my male line ancestor, came to Virginia in 1686. My great-grandfather, Levi Blankinship, was a corporal in Jeff Stewart's cavalry in the Civil War. In fact, he was very proud of, and he attended the 50th anniversary and came to the Battle of Gettysburg, for example. And my Norwegian ancestors all came between 1866 and 1885. So in other words, all of my genes have been located in America for a very long time. And so going back to my grandmother, when she died, my grandfather, although my mother was quite insistent that her parents had never, ever attended church, ever, and was very insistent on that. Nevertheless, my grandfather had gone to Sunday school as a child, and he, perhaps recollecting that, got a Congregationalist minister who officiated at the funeral, which was in 1954, when I was 5, and they thought, well, he sounds good, you know, social gospel or social justice concerns, so maybe we should give our sons some ethical, religious training in that sense, because they weren't interested in liturgies, in faith, in salvation, and all that stuff they had no interest in. But the interest was in the worldly side, which is shared here by the Ethical Society. So, for 11 years we were members of the Congregational Church, which became the United Church of Christ, which is the extreme left wing of Christianity, if you like, which is the point in Christianity where to go beyond it, there's no Christ in Christianity. But you have the Unitarians, and then you have something like my niece joined the New Thought movement that you may have or may not have ever heard of, which is like religious services with no Christ. They call it the church, they have a pastor, but they just completely excise the whole concept of Christ from it. And there's a lot of parallel in that actually with my thinking too as it emerged. But unlike my brothers who used to hide when religious service was going to be held, when we were going to Sunday school or go to church, they would go hide in the closet or under the bed. They hated that. And I think they still don't. Although my brother's second wife has kind of forced him to join the Russian Orthodox Church. But I can't conceive that he really changed. And so there's that kind of going away from that. It is something that you might be very familiar with. However, I always liked the religious services. I liked that part of it. But when I studied it carefully, I could not accept it. And I can't go into why I rejected Christianity, because before I came here, my wife admonished me, do not say anything bad about Christianity. So, okay. So anyway, I left that, and then I went on my own spiritual quest, which led me to traveling, where I traveled in the Middle East, and I liked the hospitality, the friendliness, the family spirit, the people there, that attracted me. And so I came back then to the United States and changed my study in history from the Roman Empire to the Muslim world, because that was living as I'd gone around the Mediterranean, visited 30 Roman ruins in different countries, and those were ruins of the past, but here were the people living now. That was more attractive and more interesting to me. So then I started thinking about it, and I thought, the last thing was, before I came back, that a Palestinian Jordanian in Amman said, well, why don't you become a Muslim like so-and-so? And even though I'd spent a year and a half in the Arab world in those days, 1970, 71, nobody had invited me to be a Muslim until that happened. Not one person. Because people weren't very religious then. Like when we were in Morocco, and I was talking to an American girl in the youth hostel and said, oh, are Muslims supposed to pray 5 times a day? And she said, yeah, but I heard the call to prayer in the mosque and nobody was going in. And so there's this false stereotype about how the Muslims are really religious, and people here are not really religious. Big mistake, not true. And so I thought at the time, oh, of course not, how silly. But as I studied Islam when I went back and resumed my university studies, it started to make sense to me. As I read the Quran, it made sense to me. It seemed to me that God, whom I had never doubted, was speaking to me out of the verses of the Quran directly out of a Semitic language that was the product of 4,000 years of development of religious concepts in Semitic languages in the Middle East. And here it was in the original language, the Arabic, which I had learned in my sojourn in the Arab countries. So I learned Arabic first, and then I came back to the United States, and then I became a Muslim in Seattle. That's when that happened, in 1973. So I practiced Islam then for over 42 years, for most of my life. And I went back and lived in the Muslim countries again. I lived in Egypt for 11 years, for example. So I lived there for a very long time. And I actually had no intention of coming back here at all, because I was perfectly comfortable and acclimatized over there. But the way things worked out, I came back, and there is a certain structural reason why it's difficult for people from here, including immigrants who come from over there to here, to go back and live in their own countries. There was this Iraqi gentleman who was an engineer for Boeing, who tried to take his family back 5 times to Iraq, and that was before all the crises hit Iraq, the wars and all that. It was before that. And each time, the Iraqi government gave him nice jobs, like a professorship in the university one time, and a position as a director in the oil company another time. It just was impossible. because it's too difficult. People have difficult lives because of various reasons. So, for better or worse, we came back here and we remained here. And because, although I got my PhD in history, I was eventually appointed in the Department of Religion at Temple, so I was identified as a sort of religious personnel. So I was invited to give the Friday sermons at the mosque, and I gradually, for a long time, gave them for once a month, and then since 1997, every week, every Friday. And so that is a very different and strange trajectory, I know, from, as someone described it, from what a lot of other people may have. And it might call forth some explanation for it, but to me it seemed that Islam was a message that was clear and pure and simple, and that dispensed with a lot of difficult theological concepts surrounding the divinity or the degree of divinity of Jesus Christ. Because in Islam, of course, Muhammad is just a human prophet, and for that matter, Jesus Christ is also a human prophet, and Moses and so on are all prophets of Islam. And so that seemed to me to be something that cut the complexity of theology down to very simple possible spirituality. And then another aspect of it is the lack of any hierarchy in the religion. To be sure, in Shiaism, the form of Islam practiced by about 12% of the Muslims and the major sect, particularly in the country of Iran, and also Iraq and Bahrain and Lebanon and Azerbaijan. Those are the Shia majority or plurality countries. There is more of a hierarchy, to be sure. But in Sunni Islam, practiced by 88% of the Muslims, which I would include myself in, there really isn't any hierarchy. And although, like in rabbinical Judaism, there used to be a kind of a closed corporation of scholars who were defined by who is literate, and to be literate, you had to go through a thoroughly religious school curriculum, so that you became a religious scholar that way. And the religious scholars taught some people who were not destined to be religious scholars, such as some of the politicians, that is, the rulers, the ruling class, who thought they needed literacy as well, or the merchant class, and they would not presume to be scholars, and they might still be literate. But in general, literacy in the pre-modern period was a very small percent of the population. Frankly, although some historians of ancient times have estimated it optimistically and said in Athens 20% of the people must have been literate trying to build up Athens. No. The default position would be 1% literacy. So that very low rate of literacy would mean that that class of people would be very influential and so on. So there was the extent there was hierarchy, that was it. In modern times, with modern mass education and mass literacy, everyone wants to adopt their own views about their religion and speak about the religion however they see fit. And so consequently, there's been an unprecedented crisis of authority in Islam in the 20th century and on into the 21st century, because there aren't the old standards that there were before, and there isn't any clear way of defining who is a religious authority. There's no ordination in Islam, so there's no ordained priesthood. And so, somewhat like the Quakers, in theory, anyone can stand up and speak and can be a religious authority like that. I myself have been an imam here for a long time. I was honored to be invited to the Durus al-Hasaniyah, which are the Hassanian lectures that were invented and held by, and turned into a media extravaganza by King Hassan II of Morocco, where I spoke 3 times in front of the king in the royal palace in the presence of all the high brass ministers of the government on one side and the ambassadors from the Muslim countries on the other side, and the king and his 2 sons in front of me, and all the scholars around me while I sat on an elevated chair in the king sat on the floor in front of me to show his humility in the relationship with the ulama, or the scholars of Islam. So I was treated as a scholar of Islam in that sense. Well, I don't think really that I have that type of religious authority, but because people invite me to preach, and because I have to attend the Friday services anyway, so I do it. But it's not my principal job. My principal job is to be a professor of religion at Temple University. So that's what I concentrate on, because that's what I'm paid to do. Now, when we come to the subject, which we gave a title here, Submission versus Freedom in Contemporary Islam and Other Modern Ideologies, that would seem to be a subject sort of loaded with the idea of submission to God on the one hand, is sort of like submitting to the dictates of the sacred text, and so that you are not being rational in that point. It's kind of an irrational submission to sacred text, whereas freedom is freedom to think and do whatever you want, right? Now, that doesn't have to be the interpretation, and that's not the interpretation I'm going to give, but that is an interpretation that would spring to mind over that. So I wrote as the synopsis here, which could be my thesis, and I think, though I usually don't like reading to an audience, I will read this and then discuss it. Islam today is often mischaracterized as both irrational and authoritarian, if not totalitarian. However, such claims depend on a narrow and ideologically charged definition of rationality. Various Muslims, rather, have always viewed their own interpretations of Islam as rational, and especially as means of liberation from authoritarianism, because God mediated through text is the source of authority, and no hierarchy of interpretive authority can easily be articulated. This contrasts with materialism, which cuts off all appeals to authority beyond humans. From this, the modern age has seen the establishment of unprecedented, extremely intrusive, and highly articulated and rationalized systems of control mediated through the state. These systems exist within the triad of nationalism, state, and people, and claim that they are liberating, but are actually subordinating. While Islam cannot be viewed as any less rational than materialist systems, which also depend on unquestioned faith, it has proven less susceptible to appropriation for purposes of domination. So that is my thesis and my argument here. Well, one thing is that when we use terms such as submission and freedom and so on, these terms have all kinds of little curlicues of meaning that come out of them, and their meaning is not something clearly defined, especially the vastly abused word freedom, which is something that was abused anciently as well. So the historian Tacitus of the Roman days put into the mouth of a certain commander during the 1st century CE that he said in Latin, nobody ever sought power for himself and the enslavement of others without invoking liberty in such fair names. And the fact is that obviously that is emphasized right down to George Orwell's 1984, where the totalitarian dictators of that book, who were based on Joseph Stalin, who arguably could be considered the worst human being who ever lived, although there is some competition for that title. They basically, freedom is slavery, and such slogans also are using this term. For my perception, the way it is that God is a concept beyond, to which one can appeal. This appeal is mentioned by St. Peter in the Gospel, rather in the Acts of the Apostles, where he says, we must obey God rather than men. There's a very significant verse there in that particular book. You must obey God rather than men. Well, what does that mean if we unpack it? It means that it is a sentence corrosive and destructive of worldly authority and attempts to construct worldly authority hierarchies and worldly authoritarianism and totalitarianism. And so the existence of God beyond to appeal to is something which the rulers never liked, because the rulers, when we go back to the oldest history of all, where we get Hammurabi receiving the commission to make the law in Babylon from the god Shamash, and where we get the pharaohs in Egypt who were God incarnate, God, Son of God, Savior of the world, sitting on the throne of Egypt, who if the pharaoh merely curled his lip, the Nile might stop running and everyone would die. I mean, talk about a totalitarian system. But, so this concept of the rulers always trying to control and mediate God is very ancient. The ancient Babylonian rulers would go up at the top of their ziggurats and commune with God, because they could go up there and be the highest and have that communion. The Son of Heaven in China, the Chinese emperor, was the only one who could worship heaven, because everyone else, it was beneath their station to be able to worship the most exalted of all. Only the emperor could do that. And so they tried to mediate this in that way. But it got loose because you can't really say, well, I have an exclusive conduit to God. If somebody else says, well, so do I. Or if somebody else says, no, you don't. Or something like that. It's not something provable. And so the rulers dominating the people would make an end run around the rulers, and the rulers would always be trying to cut that off in whatever way they could. This succeeded most immensely in the modern times with the modern state. And the modern state, although I titled my book, The End of the Jihad State, the collapse, Reign of Shamir ibn Abdul Malik and the collapse of the Umayyads. This is a history book about 8th century history. When the Umayyads collapsed, that was the end of the universal caliphate, and the Muslims were never united again. After the revolt of the Berbers in 740, that was it. And Islam was politically unified until 740. From that time down to the present, almost 1,300 years, it has never been united again politically. And this other writer, Wa al-Hallaq, a Palestinian Christian, who wrote the book The Impossible State, Islam, Politics, and Modernity's Moral Predicament, says we shouldn't even use the word state for medieval and ancient political organization, because the state is something that is implacably modern, implacably intrusive, implacably impersonal, and so on. So it becomes a matter of state. And I do highly recommend this book by Wa al-Hallaq, The Impossible State, in which he is saying that, well, the Muslims can't really have a state because they would have to give up their ethics, their moral input, because the modern state creates its own ethics. And so therefore, in effect, it's like an idol that comes and sits on God's throne and demands obeisance from everyone. And this can be seen in various forms. For the highest, most extreme, most complete development of nationalist ideology might be Hitler and Nazism. Then again, maybe not. Maybe something else is. But the rampant nationalisms that are all over the world today are not in the least bit weakened or curtailed by the defeat of Hitler in World War II. And one should not suppose that nationalism is going out. Rather, nationalism is going in, and it is influencing everything in ways that I do not see beneficial. So the concept of the modern state that bases itself on scientism and materialism, bases itself on a spiritual lineage that is very ancient indeed, that goes back to the materialist lineage from Leucippus to, or rather from Xenophanes to Leucippus to Democritus to Epicurus to Lucretius, which insists on the complete materialism of everything and the lack of anything else. And this tradition is sometimes called skeptical. And so if you look at skeptics.com or skeptics.org and such things, you will see people there proclaiming themselves skeptics who actually pertain to the materialist tradition, not the skeptical tradition. The skeptical tradition, rather, is the tradition that comes from Diogenes of Sinope to Metrodorus of Chios to Pyrrho to Sextus Empiricus. And that tradition is summed up in the creed of Metrodorus of Chios, who said, "We do not know anything. We do not know whether we know, or we do not know, nor whether knowing and not knowing exist, nor whether there is anything or not." And in Sextus Empiricus, there are various attractive articles with titles like "Against the Professors," "Against the Logicians," "Against the Mathematicians," and so on. So the skeptical tradition is a complete denial of the possibility of knowledge. And it cannot be viewed as a validation of any form of materialism. That is something we have to make a clear distinction from. I make that distinction because I myself am more sympathetic and closer to the skeptical tradition, because if the skeptical tradition is true about the basis of knowledge in the rational sense, then it opens the door somewhat to intuitive knowledge. That is something that I know to be true because I know it is true. But I feel something is true, so therefore it is true. And so that becomes a basis for another possible type of knowledge. Now, I'm not saying that those skeptics would accept that, but I'm saying that it is at least a step closer to that than materialism is. So materialism serves the interest of the state, as we saw in Soviet statism, materialism, state atheism, and so on. And it makes a structure which there is no escape from, because the state itself transforms itself into a kind of god or deity. And I've often said, in order to demonstrate the prevalence of this, because since America is the prevalent power in the world, Americans usually do not like to have themselves described as nationalists, because nationalist is for everybody else. Even though there might be some give on that, and some people might admit, yes, there is nationalism, and other people would deny it, but rather they would say, we are patriots, everyone else are nationalists. That would be the distinction that they would make. And you can have a little thought experiment of what would happen if you placed a Bible in a public place, maybe in front of some evangelical Christians, and went and stomped on it and abused it. And they would say, probably, what are you doing that for? Please don't do that. Comparing that with if you place an American flag in the same place and stomp on it and abuse it and see what happens. And by that experiment, you can see where people's sacred and holy things really are. And if that is so, then there comes to be very little basis for not regarding nationalism as a religion, as indeed it might be. And that brings me to the other book to show you, this Show and Tell by William T. Cavanaugh, The Myth of Religious Violence. William T. Cavanaugh is a professor at DePaul University in Chicago, and the book is somewhat deceptively titled, although he does deal with the myth of religious violence in the book, but the book also is a deconstruction of the very concept of religion, where it shows that religion has been constructed, not by any plotting or any conscious thing, but by a gradual process where the construction has been taken advantage of and developed. It has been developed by statists who want to eliminate ethics from the area of statecraft in order to attribute and give absolute untrammeled power to the state with no ethical or moral limits whatsoever. And we see this around us in our society all over the place every day, in economic relations, in banking, in political talk, and so on. And so the idea is that if you can call something religious, you can disregard it. So people will say, oh, well, you're just religious, so we don't have to listen to any complaint or any comment or any criticism that you make, because it comes from a religious side. And the people who are religious then will try to argue back and say, no, it's not religious that our claim is an ethical, moral claim. And they say, oh, no, it's based on religion, so it's just invalid. We won't listen to it at all. We completely dismiss it. This is very nicely illustrated by Richard Dawkins, the British biologist who is described as the icy atheist by John Horgan in his book, The End of Science. And John Horgan was the Scientific American journalist who went around to all of these famous scientists and discussed things with them, and then published it all in this book, and which the aficionados of those scientists were very distraught because these were golden words from their heroes, but on the other hand, they were framed in the way that they'd been looked at. And so Richard Dawkins, the icy atheist, who argued, if you would argue with someone like Philip Johnson, the evangelical Christian, who has weighed in on against evolution and whatnot, you'd have an easy time blasting Philip Johnson for starting from a religious point of view. But when the philosophy professor of Newcastle on Tyne, Mary Midgley, came against him, he couldn't do that because she's an agnostic. And he couldn't pin religion on her, even though he would have loved to do it. And he got so flustered and so angry at Mary Midgley, he just lost it. Because she was saying, you're preaching, you're a preacher. They were preaching a religion. Mary Midgley has 2 books. Actually, she has 20 books, but 2 of the titles are Evolution as a Religion, and another one, Science as Salvation. And she's pretty sarcastic, too, I have to admit, where she is saying, oh, how comfortable it is to stand alone and say, I am a rock, I am an island against the cruel universe and know it all. And so she can be pretty sarcastic herself, but he couldn't get her, precisely because she wasn't standing on the ground of religion. So the whole message of Kavanaugh seems to be that the very concept of religion as constructed is an invalid concept. It is either it is a concept that is too narrow because it takes in spiritual religions with ethical and moral claims and dismisses those as irrelevant. Whereas it ought to put into that same category all of the other ideologies that exist. That is why I often say, everybody has a religion, whether they like it or not. And the religion of a person has to be either the basic beliefs that they have, their foundational beliefs, or they could be confused. And if they're confused, I'll grant, then they don't have a religion. But otherwise, people have a religion, and people have sacred things, and so on. And just because they have a myth of secularism and imagine that there is such a thing, isn't something that should get them off the hook when some kind of debate about this is going on. Now, in all of that, I'm not trying to deny that there are many problematical people who base things on religion and say lots of nasty things, and people who are mean and cruel and so on. And I'm not denying that for a minute. But I think unless we put all ideology on the same footing, or all religion, if you prefer, then we aren't going to get anywhere in the discussion, because we're going to be talking past each other. That's what I think and say, and I guess that fills my half hour, so I can just end there. And I thank you kindly, all of you, for listening to me.
Well, you've certainly, Dr. Blankinship, you've given us a lot to chew on, and I look forward to the dialogue, and I hope all of you do, and will join us upstairs after the conference. Thank you again.